said to her just a moment ago for being a bit of a guinea pig and doing the first Zoom seminar, but we're very glad that she's able to provide this presentation. For those who don't know Meghan yet, Meghan's an assistant professor in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing here at KU. Her research primarily is focused on language comprehension in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And today she's going to talk to us about understanding reading in autism, which is certainly a topic that we have not focused on in previous seminars. So I'm excited to hear about this new work. Before she jumps in, I should say everybody is doing it right now, but I just ask that people keep their Zoom, their computers on mute during the course of the talk. If there are necessary questions during the talk, just for clarity, quick questions for clarity, then you can bring yourself off mute and either raise your hand and I'll try to find you. If I don't see you, then go ahead, you can jump in, but we'll reserve all longer questions and conversation discussion for the end of the talk. Okay, so with that, Meghan, thanks for being here and I'll let you get started.
All right, sounds great. Well, thank you all for attending, just like Matt said, and yes, this is a new format for all of us, so we'll do our best. So I made some assumptions when I was preparing today's talk, given that it was for the KCART research seminar, that most people attending the talk are familiar with the characteristics of autism, how autism is diagnosed, and basic things that we see in autism. So instead, what I have focused on in this talk is some general information about what we see in reading and reading development, and then diving into specifically what we see in children with autism, and why this is an interesting area. So I titled the talk Diving Deeper into Understanding Reading in ASD because we've had a general notion that children with autism have difficulties with reading comprehension for a long time, but we haven't for a long time, and yet I still don't think we can completely understand why so many children have difficulty in this area. So starting off with just some really quick basic information about reading and reading development. Let's see. We had it. There we go. So reading, as Matt mentioned, my area is on language comprehension, and I focus on language comprehension in the spoken language modality and the written language modality. So reading comprehension is language in the written language modality, and there's this reciprocal relationship. So spoken language supports written language comprehension, and then as individuals develop in their written language abilities, that also then supports spoken language abilities. So spoken language and written language are these two really tightly nested skills and abilities. There's been a primary developmental framework of reading development that's been very predominant the last 20 or so years, known as the simple view of reading. So I'm going to walk you guys through that because that's kind of the foundation of a lot of this work. More recently, another model has sort of built on the simple view of reading to add in a few more specific predictors. So the simple view of reading was initiated at a relatively controversial time in the realm of reading and understanding reading development. And so the goal in Goff and colleagues' introduction of it was that we're just going to keep reading and understanding how reading develops simple so that we can actually figure out what to do in our educational approaches. So that being said, however, reading is very complex and it's quite difficult to capture in a single framework. However, there's a lot of empirical evidence to support the simple view of reading. So the way that the simple view of reading goes is it's very formulaic. So we have reading comprehension as our goal. So reading comprehension referring to the ability to actually understand what you're reading. I think most people can agree on this. And then there are two components that support reading comprehension, and we take the product of those two components. So the first component is our word reading abilities, also sometimes referred to as word recognition or decoding. It kind of goes by a lot of names. But this refers to your ability to take the sounds in your language and match them to the symbols in the written language. It's a really important process that is the focus of a lot of early reading education. But there's another really important component, and that is listening comprehension. So when Goff and colleagues originally thought of this listening comprehension, they thought of it as a parallel form to the reading comprehension, although it has been interpreted much more broadly as your oral language skills in general. So basically, the formula is you take the product of your word reading skills and your listening comprehension skills, and that predicts your reading comprehension. Now, we can use the work of Hugh Katz and colleagues to then classify different profiles of reading based on this formula. So across the top dimension, I have word reading, and across the side dimension, I have listening comprehension. And here we're using a 1 to indicate if an individual in a profile has good abilities, and a 0 to indicate if an individual has poor abilities. So if an individual has good word reading abilities and good listening comprehension abilities, then the simple view of reading would predict that they have good reading comprehension with both of those two components intact. And so this would be the profile of our good reader. Now, if we have an individual who has poor word reading abilities, but good listening comprehension abilities, the simple view of reading would predict that they would have poor reading comprehension, but this would be the result of their poor word reading ability. So their inability to map those sounds of the language to the symbols on the page. And this is our profile of dyslexia, also sometimes referred to as poor decoders. So a lot of people tend to be pretty familiar with dyslexia, at least in name, but another important profile is that of the poor comprehender. Now this is in contrast to dyslexia because these individuals have good word reading abilities, but poor listening comprehension abilities. Now their reading comprehension is poor, but now instead of it being a result of their word reading abilities, it's a result of their listening comprehension abilities. Now, given the strong focus on development of word reading abilities earlier in development, typically starts around kindergarten or first grade, a lot of poor comprehenders get missed early in development because they have those word reading skills. But then they get to the fourth grade and third or fourth grade, and in education something happens where we shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And now in third or fourth grade, there's an expectation that children have the basics of reading, at least in terms of word reading, and they can use that to learn new information. And that's where a lot of these poor comprehenders tend to get caught. That being said, there is evidence that indicates that earlier, before we actually typically catch them in the education system, these individuals have a lot of difficulties in listening comprehension. We're just not paying attention to it. Now, the last profile is known as the mixed deficit, and these individuals have difficulties in both word reading abilities and listening comprehension, which obviously results in poor reading comprehension abilities. So here's the simple view of reading again. I've just reworked the frame. So again, reading comprehension is our goal, and it's the product of these two components, word reading and listening comprehension. Now, while the simple view of reading has done a lot in terms of advancing our understanding of skills for reading development, it is a simple view. And so more recently, another model our framework has been introduced, which is the direct and indirect effects model of reading comprehension, or DIER. So the DIER model builds on the simple view of reading and suggests that word reading and listening comprehension as per the empirical evidence supporting the simple view of reading, have these direct effects on reading comprehension. But there are a subset of other skills that we can specify that have indirect effects through listening comprehension and word reading. So I'll just briefly walk you through these. So at the first level, we have inferencing ability, theory of mind, and comprehension monitoring. And all of these skills support listening comprehension. So inferencing refers to one's ability to either connect two pieces of information in text or a piece of information in text to our background knowledge, what we already know. Theory of mind also supports listening comprehension in relation to ability to understand characters' perspectives, motivations, goals, emotions, as well as the ability to understand author perspective. And then we have comprehension monitoring. So this is what we are all already doing very naturally as good readers, is we're monitoring our comprehension to make sure that we're understanding what we are reading. And if we don't understand, going back in the text and rereading to make sure that we correct for that misunderstanding. And then we have the skills related to oral language, specifically vocabulary ability and what Kim referred to as grammar, also referred to as morphosyntax. And vocabulary and grammar are then supporting these higher order skills, which then go on to support listening comprehension. And lastly, there's been a lot of work in the realm of reading, looking at the role of working memory, which does support individuals' vocabulary and grammar abilities, again, cascading upwards. So all of these skills are important for listening comprehension. And again, we have to go with that original notion of Goff and colleagues that listening comprehension is this parallel of reading comprehension. And these other language skills are then supporting listening comprehension, which then supports reading comprehension. I'll also just note that vocabulary, grammar, and working memory also have indirect effects on word reading. All right, so there's obviously a lot more work on reading and reading development, but I wanted to make sure that we quickly got into looking at what this looks like in children with autism. So I'll be talking a little bit about what profiles do we see in reading in children with ASD, looking at some predictors of reading in ASD, and then my more recent work looking at what is the role of social communication, which we know is an inherent deficit in ASD. How does that contribute to what we're seeing in reading in this population? So beginning with reading profiles in ASD, there is this a fair amount of work early on showing this, what I refer to as the classic profile of reading. So based on the simple view of reading, I refer to this as the poor comprehender, poor reading comprehension profile. Sometimes other people have referred to it as hyperlexia. There's some arguments for not using that term, considering that hyperlexia is often contingent on seeing early, before the age of 3, reading skills, which is rarely captured. So even if later in development children are struggling with comprehension, we still want to identify that profile. So based on the seminal work of Nation and colleagues in 2006, they used the simple view of reading to classify reading profiles in autism, and they found that 65% of their sample had the poor comprehender profile. Now, other studies that have been done, they have ranged from 38 to 73%. This range is largely a reflection of who gets included in the sample. So pretty predominantly, most of the research that I'm going to talk about, and I'll note the exceptions, do not include children who have minimal verbal abilities and do not include children who have low nonverbal cognition, and certainly do not include children with intellectual disability. But as we know in autism, there's a large range across all of those abilities. And so depending on the exact selection criteria for each study, we do see a difference in the estimated percentage. So knowing that these children are struggling with comprehension later in development, with reading comprehension later in development, but also with my work looking at language comprehension early in development, so around ages 2.5 to 5.5, I really became interested in what do we see then earlier before we catch the poor comprehenders, 4th grade and on. Is there a way that we can see this profile earlier in development? So I'm going to talk about that study and then take another sort of developmental step in looking at these profiles. So we looked at reading profiles at age 5.5 years. And the first thing that we did, well, first I'll orient you to the test that we used. So we used the test of early reading abilities. This test is comprised of 3 subtests. There's the alphabet subtest, the convention subtest, and the meaning subtest. The alphabet subtest is looking at precursor skills, such as phonological awareness, letter naming, as well as other skills that are going to then predict an individual's word reading abilities. Convention subtest looks at children's general familiarity with literate activities. So can they correctly turn a book the right way? Can they identify where a title and author are on a book cover? Can they identify the difference between a list versus a story? Just those sort of conventional aspects. And then which relates to their exposure to literate activities. And then the meaning subtest, which is looking at their, basically looking at their language comprehension with written materials. Now I do want to be clear because I get asked this question a lot. At age 5.5, we're not asking children to actually read anything. So these are really looking at some of those precursor skills. So the first thing that we did, the first question that we had was to look at whether or not we saw evidence of the poor comprehender profile at this early age, at age 5.5. So we had a sample that's pretty large in this area of 94 children. This is the one exception where we did not exclude children based on their nonverbal cognitive abilities. Our only criteria of exclusion was that they completed the test. There were very few children that did not complete the test. So if we map on the alphabet subtest onto our word reading skills and our meaning subtest onto our listening comprehension skills, which you see here on the x-axis, and then we have the performance on the y-axis, we found a large and significant difference between children's word reading skills and their listening comprehension skills as an entire sample here. Therefore, we took this as evidence that yes, we do see evidence of this poor comprehender profile at an early age. That being said, I wasn't entirely satisfied with this answer. And so we used a slightly different approach to begin to tease apart these profiles. So if so many children are having difficulties with comprehension, do they all look the same or are there differences? In order to begin to tease that apart, we used a latent profile analysis. Our analysis resulted in a 4-profile comparison. So I've presented the conventions information here just so you can see. We're kind of going to largely ignore that for now. I'm going to highlight here in yellow the average range of performance for this test. So again, we have performance on the y-axis and then our subtests on the x-axis. I'm going to again map on the alphabet subtest to word reading abilities and the meaning subtest to listening comprehension. So if we look at these 4 profiles, profile 1 is a very high performing profile. So they're performing above average in both their word reading abilities and their listening comprehension abilities. This accounted for 7% of our sample, and we would have no concerns about individuals falling in this profile's reading abilities. In profile 2, what we see is we have individuals with above average word reading abilities, but kind of low average listening comprehension abilities. So the poor comprehender profile in the literature has been diagnosed 2 different ways. One is the discrepant poor comprehender profile. That is where there is a discrepancy between their word reading abilities and their listening comprehension. And the other is where they just have low listening comprehension abilities. So this profile too is an indication of that discrepant profile, because we see the really high word reading abilities, but the lower listening comprehension abilities. Given that we're predicting into the future, we would have some concern about these children going on and having difficulties later on with reading comprehension. And this accounted for 42% of our sample. Now with profile 3, we again see a discrepancy in that these children had word reading abilities falling in the average range, but then listening comprehension abilities falling below average. But this group would also qualify for the poor comprehender profile based on their poor listening comprehension. And this accounted for 20% of the individuals in our sample. And then lastly, in profile 4, we see that mixed deficit. So these are individuals that are having difficulties with word reading abilities, as well as listening comprehension abilities. And this accounted for 31% of the individuals in our sample. So if we look across all of these profiles that were having comprehension difficulties at age 5.5, that accounted for 93% of the children in our sample. So this is a little bit larger. We are being a little bit generous in what we're including here, given that there would potentially be signs or reasons to be concerned about how these children go on to develop their reading comprehension. Now, as a follow-up, McIntyre and colleagues have looked at profiles of reading in children with ASD from 8 to 14 years, which is more the sort of typical age range that we're looking at. And again, they used a latent profile analysis. They found 4 profiles. These profiles are somewhat similar to the profiles that we found early in development, but there are also some differences. So in profile 1, they also found that some individuals were average readers. This accounted for 32.1% of their sample. So these individuals did not have any difficulties in either word reading abilities or language comprehension. In profile 2, which is this sort of flat small dot line with the triangles, this is what they referred to as a global disturbance. So I would refer to these individuals as having a mixed deficit in that they have both word reading difficulties and language comprehension difficulties, but they're falling around 1 standard deviation below the mean. In profile 3, they did find evidence of the poor comprehender profile. So this profile had the high word reading abilities, but lower language comprehension in that sort of discrepant form. This accounted for 20.6% of their sample. And then in profile 4, this is what they termed the severe global disturbance. So again, a mixed deficit where children are having difficulties with word reading and language comprehension, but it's to a greater degree than profile 2. There is some evidence that as children develop, even if they early on look like they have really good word reading skills, as those skills become more difficult, so we have higher expectations for the types of words that they need to be able to read, which tends to rely more on their language skills, that we actually see those word reading skills decline. And so the potential differences between the Davidson and Ellis Weismer study and this study may reflect that, but there's very few longitudinal studies in this area, so we don't know for sure. Again, looking across the 3 profiles related or showing deficits in language comprehension, this would account for 67.9% of the sample. So in the reading profiles, we definitely see that poor reading comprehension is the predominant issue that we're seeing. However, for some of the individuals, this is the only issue, whereas for a large number of individuals, it's also co-occurring with word reading difficulties. It is worthwhile to mention that what we don't see in terms of profiles of reading in ASD is that well-known profile of reading dyslexia. So we do not see the profile where we see a strength in language comprehension, but weaknesses in word reading. I have heard a few cases of it occurring, but overall in the population, that does not seem to be what we see. So now I'm going to move on to considering predictors of reading in ASD. And I'm going to look at some earlier predictors and then some later predictors. So in that same study where we classified the different profiles, we also looked at concurrent and longitudinal predictors of early reading abilities. And then based on the results of those, a series of regressions, we proposed this tentative model of early reading abilities in ASD. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but a few important things to point out are that we have sort of our expected predictor of oral language abilities based on what we know in typical development. We looked at both receptive and expressive abilities. We also include socioeconomic status as measured by mother's years of education, which we know to be an important predictor, particularly of early reading abilities, and ensuring that children have access to literate materials and are getting some instruction and exposure to those materials. And then we included nonverbal cognition. As I noted, we included a wide range of abilities, so it's not surprising to see that it was a significant predictor here. We also looked at autism severity as well as social abilities, which have not really been looked at either in the general population or in children with autism at this point. So those were sort of what we consider to be unique predictors in autism. So moving on to our later predictors, coming out of the autism literature, one predictor has largely been the weak central coherence, which comes from the weak central coherence theory. The idea, for those who are unfamiliar with this, is that children with autism are better at processing details over the gestalt or whole picture, and that this is a processing style. This is argued to capture reading performance, at least in terms of that classic profile, if we think of word reading skills as the details and comprehension skills as the gestalt and the integration of those details. However, we know that, at least from the general population, that oral language plays a big role. And so there's been a little bit of a battle in the literature between, is it weak central coherence or is it oral language? So we dove into this battle a little bit in our paper in 2017, where we looked at ambiguous sentence comprehension. So although weak central coherence and oral language had been looked at to some degree in listening comprehension, it had not actually been looked at within reading. So I'll just walk you through this study real quick. Before I get into the study details, I just want to mention this notion of products versus processes, or comprehension products versus comprehension processes. So comprehension products refer to what we usually think of when we think of how we are measuring comprehension. So we have somebody listen to or read a story, and then we ask them questions. So products are a reflection of our comprehension after we have completed the actual task of comprehension. However, comprehension processes are going to be more the processes that are occurring while processing is ongoing. There are a couple different ways to measure this, but the approach that I used in this study was to use eye tracking methodology. And Rapp and Vandenbroek, as well as others, argue that we really need to be measuring both comprehension products and processes, and that there could be potential differences in individuals at these different points in comprehension. So in our study, we're looking at ambiguous sentence comprehension and whether or not children are able to integrate that information in order to ambiguate the sentence. We had 23 children with autism, 23 typically developing children. These two groups were matched on chronological age, socioeconomic status, again measured in mother's years of education, as well as nonverbal cognition, with all participants having scores above 80. And what we did is we had participants sit in front of an eye tracker, a Tobii T60, so looked much like this, and we tracked their eye movements while they were reading sentences. And so that's our measure of comprehension processes. And then for our comprehension products measure, we had them do a picture verification to forced choice task where they responded via button box about which picture went with the sentence. And I'll show you some examples here so you can see how that goes. So we had 4 conditions in this study. The first 2 conditions were just our neutral conditions that we used to compare. You'll note here that we're not asking participants to understand very long or complicated sentences. They're very simple sentences. However, our first condition of interest is what we refer to as the bias dominant condition. So in this condition, an ambiguous word appeared at the end. In this example, the ambiguous word is bat. And then the context that appeared before it disambiguated that word, either towards the dominant meaning, which is the meaning that's most often referenced most quickly, or in our other condition, toward the subordinate meaning, which is the meaning that's less commonly accessed. Basically, what has to occur in order to accurately process these sentences is you have to override the dominant meaning, integrate the context to get to the subordinate meaning. So what we're going to see is I'm going to show you just a quick video of what these eye movements look like. You'll see both in the neutral all 4 conditions, but I'll kind of walk you through what you're seeing in the bias subordinate condition when we get there. So in the bias subordinate condition, what we're going to see is we're going to see when they get to that ambiguous word at the end, they're going to pause. They're going to go back and reread the sentence to disambiguate the meaning and then move on. And then we can see how that differs from the 2 previous conditions if you caught it, or you can see how it differs from this neutral condition where you're just going to see a straight pass with relatively little time spent on each word. All right, so in terms of our comparison of comprehension products on the left and comprehension processes on the right, in both groups, we saw that comprehension processes indicated better comprehension than the comprehension products. That being said, the 2 groups did not significantly differ in terms of comprehension processes. But the group with autism had significantly lower performance than the typically developing group for the comprehension products. We did look at some individual differences and predictors of performance for the comprehension products. So the typically developing control group is in black, and the group with ASD is in gray. So we looked at chronological age, although it's really common to use this wide of age range in these studies in order to get enough participants. There's actually a lot of reading development that occurs between the ages of 8 and 14 years. So we wanted to see if age had an effect and just look at development, and it did. We also looked at word recognition, so their basic abilities to read these sentences, and again, as their word reading abilities improved, so did their comprehension of these sentences. And then we looked at a measure of vocabulary depth, which I'm not going to go into the details of, but was essentially a measure of whether or not they understood both of the ambiguous meanings of the words. And we only used words with 2 ambiguous meanings. So, and that also was a predictor. So yes, the children with autism are performing worse, but we do see that these individual differences are also related to performance. And so we would argue that it was not weak central coherence that was capturing this performance, but was more related to individual differences, including particularly that vocabulary depth, which would be related to their oral language abilities. And then another area of predictors is that in executive function, and in particular, as I noted when discussing the DIER model, working memory. So we were the first to look at the role of working memory in reading comprehension in children with autism. We looked at 3 different tasks, which you can see pictured here. I'm not going to go into the specific hypotheses related to these, but we considered the shape to be nonverbal, so not involving language, whereas the object and word did involve language, and we hypothesized that might be to varying degrees. But instead, I'm just going to kind of focus on the big picture here. So looking at working memory performance across these 3 tasks, when that was solely entered into the model, it did account for a significant amount of variability in reading comprehension for children with autism and their typically developing peers. However, when we added additional predictors, including chronological age, word reading abilities, vocabulary, and group membership, then work these with reading comprehension. And so one area that I began to explore is the role of social communication. A handful of studies have shown that social communication is a significant predictor of reading comprehension. And in McIntyre and colleagues and Ricketts and colleagues, they showed that this was above and beyond word reading and oral language skills. But again, with the notion of diving deeper in this topic, I don't think that social communication is a general predictor of reading comprehension. And that relates to this notion that we really need to consider the text type and reader-text interactions. So in terms of text type, this is most easily conceptualized as if we consider narrative fiction text versus expository fiction text. And I know anecdotally a lot of people either with autism themselves or who work with an individual with autism will say, well, you know, they can read blah, 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 the Book of Whales, but not Moby Dick. And perhaps the reason for this is that, as argued by Marr and Oatley, narrative text like Moby Dick is inherently social. It's about our social world and how to interact in our social world. So if you already have social communication deficits, perhaps this genre is going to be more difficult to understand. Now, that's the working hypothesis. We know that in typically developing children, the opposite is true. So typically developing children understand narrative text better than they do expository text. There are some potential multiple reasons for this, but the argument has largely been that children can rely on their understanding of the social world when reading narrative text in order to interpret and understand it. So genre is one way to capture these differences between text, but I am currently working on a paper that has looked at how do we actually measure how much social information is contained in a text, something I refer to as social, text socialness. Genre is one aspect, but we can also look at the number of mental and emotional state words, which would relate to aspects of theory of mind. We use the number of pronouns to look at how much character referencing is occurring. And then the proportion of dialogue in the text to look at how much conversation is occurring. I'm not going to go into the details of this series of studies, but we do see that narrative fiction has the more narrative-like genre, higher mental and emotional state words, higher incidence of pronouns, and higher dialogue. And still needs to be worked out exactly how all of these specific aspects could potentially be contributing. But I wanted to mention this because in the current work, we use these measures to specify what we mean by our social versus non-social, or more social versus less social texts. So when I'm talking about reader-text interactions, what I've largely talked about here are the reader characteristics. So what are their oral language abilities? What are their nonverbal cognitive abilities? What is their social communication? But in truth, the text also has a lot of different characteristics. So we know that texts differ in terms of their word frequency, which would relate to the type of vocabulary that's included in the text, in terms of syntactic complexity, in terms of the number of cohesive devices that help you to make connections in text. So all of these are potential things that differ. And then as I just showed you, I also make the argument that they differ in text socialness. And so if we really want to understand what's going on in comprehension, then we need to account for both the reader characteristics and the text characteristics. There's been a very small number of studies that have attempted to do this in typically developing children, where they show that these different factors are coming together to play a role. And so I wanted to begin to do that in children with autism. So we conducted a very small pilot study looking at social versus non-social comprehension. Our research questions were, is reading comprehension of non-social texts better than social texts? And as I noted, those were defined based on our measures. And how does comprehension of these texts relate to measures of vocabulary and social communication? So very small pilot study. We had adolescents with autism between the ages of 14 and 17, and we had 12 adolescents to measure the participant characteristics. We used the social responsiveness scale to capture social communication, and then the WASI to capture nonverbal cognition as well as vocabulary. And then our text characteristics were differentiated on those measures that I showed you. So here I have an example start of a text from a non-social story, and then a non-social text, and then a social text. So you can kind of see some of the differences. Basically, these were pretty short texts, no longer than a paragraph, and then children had to answer one question about the text that they read. So we compared social versus non-social text comprehension, and we found a significant and large effect where these adolescents with ASD were overall comprehending the non-social text better than they were the social text. I will note that comprehension is still pretty poor overall, and that our total possible score is 16, and they're still even in the non-social text at about 8, but we do see this difference between text type. And then looking at the correlations, the preliminary evidence is a little more fuzzy here. So we did not find significant relationships between non-social and social text comprehension and vocabulary, which is a little bit surprising. It might have to do with our measure. We'll have to tease that apart a little bit more. And then for our non-social text comprehension that was not related to social communication, it was not quite significant, and I don't like to interpret too much of marginal significance, but considering it is a pilot study, it was promising that this was more closely approximated significance for our social text and our social communication. These were correlations with 12 participants with autism, so we definitely need some more participants in order to fully know if these individual characteristics are relating to their performance. And so this takes us into our future directions. So we're now looking at listening comprehension in 7 to 9-year-olds with children who are typically developing and children who have autism. We're looking at their comprehension processes. So while they are listening to the stories, they're also looking at illustrations of those stories, and we can look at how they are looking at those illustrations relative to the stories. The illustrations contain both social and non-social information. And then we're also looking at their comprehension products, asking them different comprehension questions. Again, we've differentiated this into social and non-social information, and they're doing this both for more social stories and less social stories. So that's just a little preview of where we are, or hopefully where we will be soon once we all get back to testing. And just briefly, I'll go ahead and summarize. So what we see is that many children with autism struggle with reading comprehension. That's been very well established. But we do see that it is to different degrees, and it is with sometimes just comprehension alone, and sometimes also with those co-occurring word reading deficits. Traditional predictors like word reading and vocabulary predict comprehension in children with ASD, but this doesn't fully account for the variability in ASD, and it doesn't fully account for why so many children with autism are having such difficulties with reading comprehension. So social communication may be an additional predictor, but I argue that this would only be for text containing social information, and that we need to be careful and be specific about that as we explore this predictor further. So briefly, I will acknowledge the many participants and their families who participated in this, in the studies that I presented today, my mentors and collaborators, my lab, and the funding agencies that supported this work. And so now we can open it up to questions, however we want to make that work.
Thank you, Megan. That was a wonderful talk. I learned a lot from it. So